Hey guys, welcome back. I am Monkey Stories. Subscribe for new videos every day. Now, let's begin.
My name is Lena Marsh, and the last time my aunt touched anything of mine, it was to drop my mother's rolling pin into a cardboard box like it was an afterthought instead of the only thing I had left of her. I was 18. It was a Tuesday. She stood in the doorway of the attic room I'd slept in for 9 years and said, "This wasn't ever really your space, Lena. It was just where we put you." 14 years later, she stood in a dessert tent at a Lakeview estate, holding a microphone that had been handed to her by an events director who worked for me, telling 200 people that the cake in front of them had been in her family for 3 generations. She had no idea the family it actually came from was mine. Welcome to Monkey Stories, where the people who were told they were guests in their own family finally get to pull up a chair at the head of the table. If you've ever been treated like an inconvenience someone was too polite to name out loud, this one's for you. Drop a comment and subscribe before we get into it, because you are going to want to remember where you were when you heard this one. To understand the dessert tent, you have to go back to the kitchen first. Every story like this starts in a kitchen. Mine did too. My mother, Vivian Marsh, raised me alone from the time I was 2, after my father decided fatherhood was a chapter he'd rather skip than finish. She never talked about him much, and I never pushed, because the version of my childhood that mattered was the one that happened in her bakery, a narrow storefront on Route 9 called Marsh and Daughters. She picked that name before she even knew if she'd have 1 daughter or 5, she used to tell me, laughing, flour dusted up to her elbows. I liked the sound of it, figured I'd grow into it. She never got the chance to have more than me. She died of a heart condition when I was 9. Sudden, fast, the kind of fast where 1 week she's icing a wedding cake at 4 in the morning and singing along to the radio. And 6 weeks later, there's a folding chair in a hospital room, and then there isn't. I have exactly a handful of memories of her that haven't gone soft and unreliable at the edges. Flour on her apron in a shape I used to think looked like a rabbit. The smell of lavender and honey rising off a cooling rack. Her voice calling my name from the back of the shop in a tone that always sounded like she was glad I existed. I have built my entire adult life trying to get back to that last one. With no father in the picture and no other family close by, I went to live with my Aunt Carol, my mother's older sister, her husband Frank, and their daughter Brooke, who was exactly my age, born 4 months apart from me almost to the week. From the very first dinner at that table, the math of that household sorted itself into 2 very different categories. And I want to be precise about the word, because categories undersells it. Brooke was a daughter. I was an arrangement. I don't think Carol ever sat down and decided to be cruel to me. I think she decided early on that her own daughter's future needed protecting from a niece who'd shown up with grief instead of a college fund already fully intact, and protecting Brooke's future turned out to require a lot of very specific, very quiet subtractions from mine. Carol never screamed. In 14 years, I never once heard her raise her voice at me. Screaming leaves witnesses, leaves bruises other people can see. What Carol did instead was administrative. She managed me the way you manage a line item you'd rather not have on the budget. Here's what managing looked like, in practice. Brooke got the bedroom with the ensuite bathroom, repainted the color she wanted the summer we turned 12. I got the attic, unfinished insulation along one wall, a window that fogged with condensation every winter, a space heater Carol said she'd replace once the budget allowed, a sentence that outlived my entire time in that house. Brooke started competitive dance at 8, a program that ran $400 a month before costumes and competition fees, and Carol drove her to every single practice without missing one. I started around the same age, doing the family's grocery shopping with a list and a debit card Carol handed me at the store entrance because "You're responsible, Lena, and Brooke has rehearsal." I want you to notice that word, responsible, because in that house, it was never a compliment. It was a job description nobody had asked me if I wanted. By 11, I was doing my own laundry and most of Brooke's. By 13, I was cooking dinner on the nights Carol had her book club, an assignment nobody framed as a chore because Carol had a talent for making obligations sound like trust. I know I can count on you, Lena. Brooke's just not as settled in the kitchen as you are. Brooke had dance. I had a stove and a cutting board, and by 14, a working knowledge of how to stretch a pound of ground beef across a family of 4 on a Tuesday. My Uncle Frank worked long shifts managing a regional distribution warehouse and came home too tired most nights to notice much of anything, which is its own particular kind of absence, the kind where a man is technically present at every dinner and still isn't really in the room. When I brought him small evidence, a comment Carol made, a chore split that wasn't fair, he had one sentence he reached for every time, delivered like he genuinely believed it was kindness. Just try not to make waves, Lena. Carol's doing her best. As if my mother dying was a wave I'd personally generated, and the correct response to it was to take up less space each year, which, to Frank's credit as an observer if nothing else, I got very good at doing. The money is the part that matters most. So stay with me here because this is the detail the rest of the story turns on. My mother had left a life insurance policy and the modest proceeds from selling her half of the bakery's lease, totaling $16,500, placed into a trust meant for my education when I turned 18. Carol was named trustee. I was 14 the first time I overheard her on the phone with the bank asking, in the same casual tone she used to order takeout, whether funds from the education account could be temporarily reallocated to cover Brooke's entry into a competitive dance intensive that cost $11,000 for the season. I didn't understand, at 14, what I'd overheard. I understood it completely 2 years later, when I was 16 and asked Carol, out of simple curiosity, how much was in my trust now, and she told me a number that was $6,200 lower than it should have been, with an explanation that used the word temporarily, the exact same way a magician uses a scarf, to give your eyes somewhere polite to look while the actual trick happens somewhere else entirely. I didn't yell. 14 years of practice had trained that reflex almost completely out of me. I asked one question. Where did it go? Carol, standing at the kitchen island with a dish towel over one shoulder, said without even looking up from what she was doing, "That money kept you fed and clothed and driven to school for 9 years, Lena. Don't stand in my kitchen acting like decency should come with dividends." Decency doesn't come with dividends. I have heard that sentence in my head unprompted at least once a month for the last 14 years. I graduated high school that June with a 3.8 GPA and an acceptance letter to a well-regarded culinary program sitting in a drawer upstairs, a fact Carol was fully aware of, because I'd told her myself, hoping in the specific stubborn way hope survives even when it shouldn't, that it might matter to her. There was no dinner, no card, no announcement. Brooke graduated the same week from her performing arts academy with a backyard party that had a rented dance floor, a photo booth, and a slideshow that ran a full 6 minutes without a single picture of me in it, despite the fact that I had lived under that roof the entire time those photos were taken and had, in at least 4 of them, been standing close enough to the frame's edge that you could see my elbow. 3 weeks after that backyard party, I asked Carol, calmly, if I could stop cooking the family's meals for free once I started at the community college in the fall, or at least be paid something close to what she'd have paid a part-time cook. Carol looked at me for a long moment, the look you give an appliance that's stopped being useful, and said the sentence I have carried through 9 apartments in 4 cities over the last 14 years. This was never your house to negotiate in, Lena. We didn't have to take you in at all. Some families wouldn't have. By the following Tuesday, a cardboard box was sitting by the front door when I came home from my shift at the grocery store. Not packed by me, packed by Carol, who had gone through my attic room and decided on her own authority what I needed and what I didn't, a violation I still don't have a clean word for. 10 years into therapy. She'd thrown in my clothes, my school folders, a paperback I'd been halfway through, and almost as an afterthought, wedged sideways along the bottom, my mother's wooden rolling pin, the one with VM burned into the handle in my mother's own careful hand, from a wood-burning kit she'd bought at a craft fair the year before she died. Carol had found it in a box of my mother's things Frank had stored in the garage and never once mentioned to me in 9 years. She threw it in the cardboard box like she was doing me a favor, clearing out clutter, and in some backwards way maybe she thought she was. My Uncle Frank stood in the kitchen doorway that evening and said nothing at all, which by then had become the entirety of his role in my life. I want to tell you I said something devastating on my way out the door. I didn't. I said, okay, picked up the box and carried it to the bus stop myself, because Carol had also, with what I can only describe as a very specific kind of restraint, not offered me a ride. If you've ever come home to find your life already packed for you by someone else's hands, comment box below. I want to know how many of us there are. The next 14 years are the part of this story my family knows absolutely nothing about, because I made very sure of that. I moved in with a coworker from the grocery store, a woman named Priya, who let me sleep on her pull-out couch for 5 months while I worked 2 jobs and started community college at night. I enrolled in culinary arts, not because I had some grand vision, but because the one steady, undamaged memory I had left of my mother lived in a kitchen, and I wanted to be near that feeling again, even if I had to build the whole room around it myself. I transferred to a proper culinary program 2 years later on a combination of loans, a small scholarship, and the $10,300 that hadn't been temporarily reallocated, working prep shifts at a hotel restaurant overnight to cover what the loans didn't. Overnight prep work teaches you things a classroom can't. It teaches you how to portion 200 servings of anything before 6 a.m. without a single complaint reaching the dining room. It teaches you that the difference between a good kitchen and a great one is almost never talent. It's whether the person plating dessert number 140 still cares as much as they did on dessert number 1. I turned out to be very good at caring that much, for reasons a therapist explained to me in roughly 4 minutes during our second session. I graduated at 22, took a pastry position at a boutique hotel 2 states away from Carol on purpose, and mailed exactly 1 graduation announcement to Frank and Carol's address. No note attached. It was never acknowledged. That was the moment I finally understood, fully and without any remaining hope attached to it, that I hadn't drifted from my family. I had been quietly subtracted from it years earlier, and the announcement was the last time I checked whether the subtraction had somehow reversed itself. It hadn't. At 24, I met Theo Voss, a line cook with steady hands and an even steadier way of listening, at the same hotel. We got married 2 years later in a courthouse with 4 guests. None of them from my side, because by then I genuinely didn't have a side to invite. On our wedding license, I became Lena Voss, a name that meant, among other things, that anyone searching for Lena Marsh in the years that followed would come up completely empty. At 27, Theo and I opened a small dessert studio together, just the 2 of us in a rented commercial kitchen space, working every wedding and event we could book through word of mouth. We named it Larkspur. No family connection, just a flower Theo liked the sound of. And our signature piece, the dessert that started getting requested by name within our first year, was a lavender honey stack cake. My mother's actual recipe, the one from Marsh and Daughters, refined and plated the way it had never quite gotten the chance to be plated in a 12-table storefront on Route 9. I never told Theo the full weight of what that recipe meant to me until our 3rd anniversary. He cried harder than I did. Within 6 years, Larkspur had grown from a 2-person operation into the most requested wedding dessert studio in the state, written up twice in regional bridal magazines, with a wait list that regularly ran 8 months out. I never once used the name Marsh in a press mention, a client contract, or a business filing. I let my old family believe whatever version of my life was easiest for them to picture. Probably nothing, if I'm honest. Probably just an absence they'd long since stopped noticing the shape of, because their version of me had stopped being any of my business the day I carried that cardboard box to the bus stop. If you're building something right now that the people who doubted you have no idea exists, I need you to hear this clearly. Quiet is not the same as small. Keep going. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in April, 14 years after the cardboard box, from a number I didn't recognize with Frank's old area code. It was my uncle. His voice had thinned in a way phone calls make more obvious than in-person visits ever do. Brooke was engaged, he told me. Wedding set for late June, 3 months out. And his voice did something complicated here, a mix of pride and something closer to nerves. They'd managed to book this incredible dessert studio, absolutely impossible to get. Apparently the best in the state. For the reception. He didn't know he was describing my own company back to me. He genuinely, completely had no idea. Carol wanted me to reach out, he added, which told me everything about whose idea this actually hadn't been. It's been a long time, Lena. She thought, family should be there for Brooke's big day. A pause, and then, almost gently, there's room for you if you want to come. Room for me. At a wedding my own company was catering, booked by the aunt who once told me decency doesn't come with dividends. neither of them having the faintest idea whose name was actually on the vendor contract, because I'd built the whole thing under a name they'd never bothered to learn. I sat with that phone call for 4 days before I called Frank back. I have to be honest with you here, because this story only works if I am. My very first instinct, underneath everything else, wasn't triumph. It was the same small, stubborn hope I'd carried at 19, at 22, at 25. The hope that an invitation like this one meant something had genuinely softened. I know better than that now. I did not know better in April. Hope is a remarkably stubborn tenant. It doesn't leave just because you've evicted it 3 or 4 times already. I called Frank back and said yes, I'd come. I did not mention that the venue's dessert vendor and my own company were the same thing. I wanted, for reasons I'm still not fully proud of, to see their faces first, without any warning at all. Comment Larkspur if you'd have kept that secret too, or subscribe now, because the wedding is where this whole thing comes apart. I flew in the Wednesday before the wedding and stayed at a hotel 40 minutes from the venue under Voss, quietly, the way I'd learned to move through my own life over the last 14 years. Visible everywhere except in the one place I used to call home. Saturday morning, my events director, a sharp, unflappable woman named Priscilla Ito, who'd been with Larkspur for 6 years, ran point on setup at the estate while I stayed back at the hotel, going over the final dessert count on my laptop with a coffee going cold beside it, the way you check whether you already know the forecast for. Around noon, I drove out and parked at the edge of the property, close enough to see the tent going up, far enough to stay a stranger in the crowd. I watched Carol arrive a little after 1, in a pale green dress, directing the valet attendants with the specific authority of a woman who believed, in some transferred, borrowed sense, that a wedding she hadn't paid for still somehow belonged to her taste. I watched Frank get out after her, grayer now, moving slower, carrying a garment bag like a man carrying an apology he'd never quite learned the words for. And I watched Brooke, 28 now, laughing with her bridesmaids on the lawn my own landscaping crew had reseeded 2 months earlier. And standing at the edge of that property, I felt something that wasn't simple at all. Not satisfaction, not anger, something closer to grief for the cousin relationship we might have had in a different house, with a different woman standing in that attic doorway with a cardboard box. I put my coffee down and went to change. My plan, as much as I had one, was to stay low profile, attend as a guest, let the day belong to Brooke, and say nothing unless something forced my hand. 14 years of building Larkspur had taught me that showing up and doing quiet, excellent work says more than any confrontation ever could. I did not walk onto that lawn planning to make a scene at my cousin's wedding. Carol found me near the guest book table at 1:30, and her face moved through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and then something fast and calculating that I can only describe as a woman instantly rewriting a story in real time to make sure she remained its hero. "Lena," she said, recovering into the bright, lacquered hostess voice I remembered from every relative who'd ever visited that house. "You made it. Isn't this all just stunning? Frank found the venue. And can you believe the luck? We got Larkspur for the desserts. They're apparently completely booked out for the year. Some very particular woman runs it. Very hands-on. But I suppose that's why the reviews are what they are." I want you to notice exactly what she did in that sentence. She described the actual owner of the dessert studio standing directly in front of her as an absent, faceless third party. Some very particular woman. In the same breath, she was praising that woman's work to my face. 14 years of being erased had trained me to catch that instantly. She had no idea she was doing it directly to me. "It's a beautiful setup," I said, which was true, and let her keep the moment, because I still hadn't decided what I wanted to do with mine. The ceremony itself was lovely. In the specific way things paid for by other people's quiet discomfort tend to be lovely on the surface. I sat near the back, next to a second cousin who spent the first several minutes trying to place me before simply asking, at which point I said, "I'm Vivian's daughter, Carol's niece," and watched him accept the sentence exactly the way it had always been designed to be accepted, as a footnote requiring no follow-up questions. It was during cocktail hour that the evening started to come apart, and not because of anything I'd done yet. Priscilla found me near the edge of the tent with the particular urgency of someone about to hand me a problem she didn't yet realize was personal. Ms. Voss, she said quietly, using the name almost none of the guests would recognize. Small heads up. The mother of the bride wants to say a few words about the cake during the toasts. Something about a family recipe, 3 generations back. Wasn't on the run of show. Should I clear it or hold her off? A family recipe, I repeated. That's what she told the DJ. Said it's been in her family for generations, and she wants it mentioned as a special detail for the guests. Priscilla watched my face carefully. Ms. Voss, is that true? Here is what I knew standing in that tent, that Priscilla had no way of knowing. My family had no 3-generation cake recipe. None. The only woman who had ever made that lavender honey stack cake in the history of my entire family tree was buried in a small cemetery 3 hours from where we were standing, and the last time Carol had been anywhere near that recipe's origins, she was throwing the woman's rolling pin into a cardboard box because an attic needed clearing for a home gym. I hadn't walked into that wedding planning to say a single word. But standing there, watching my aunt prepare to hand my mother's memory to 200 strangers as a piece of her own family's borrowed history, moved something in me that 14 years of careful, deliberate silence had never quite managed to move. Let it happen, I told Priscilla, and then find me right after. The toast began at 8. Frank went first. Short, warm, the kind of toast a man gives when he's trying hard not to think too closely about which of his 2 daughters is sitting near the back of the tent. Then Carol rose, glass lifted, and delivered what I'll admit, even now, was a genuinely polished performance. She spoke about Brooke's discipline, her years of dance, the family's values, and then, exactly as promised, she pivoted toward the dessert table. And I have to say something about this incredible cake, she said, glowing under the string lights. This recipe has been in our family for 3 generations. My grandmother's recipe, believe it or not, passed all the way down to me. I like to think she'd be so proud of the family we've built. 200 people raised their forks to a grandmother who, as far as 14 years of overheard family history had ever told me, had run a dry cleaners in a strip mall and never once, to my knowledge, owned a rolling pin. I stood up. I hadn't planned a speech. I want you to understand that, because everything about my childhood in that house had been rehearsal. Every sentence measured before it left a mouth. Every feeling managed for whatever audience happened to be watching. I did not do that here. I simply stood, and the tent, sensing an unscheduled disruption the way rooms do, went quiet on its own. I'm sorry to interrupt, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected it to. But I actually own the company that made this cake, and I think there's a small misunderstanding about its history I'd like to correct because it matters to me personally. 200 faces turned. I watched Frank's expression do something I hadn't seen from him in over a decade. Real, unguarded shock. I watched Carol's fork stop an inch above the plate. This cake is a lavender honey stack cake, I said. It's my company's signature dessert, and it's also the exact recipe my mother, Vivian Marsh, used to make at a bakery she owned on Route 9 before she died when I was 9 years old. I run Larkspur. My married name is Voss. I've catered this recipe at over 300 weddings, and every single time I've thought about her. I don't know anything about a grandmother's recipe passed down 3 generations, and I don't think anyone in this tent does either, including the woman who just told you about it. The silence had a particular texture, the kind that happens when 200 people simultaneously do arithmetic they weren't expecting to do at a wedding. Carol, I continued, keeping my voice gentle, because I genuinely wasn't trying to ruin Brooke's night, only to stop watching my mother's memory get quietly rewritten and repackaged in real time. You packed my things into a cardboard box when I was 18 and told me this house was never mine to negotiate in. I didn't come here tonight to negotiate anything either. I came because Frank asked me to. And some small part of me hoped that might mean something had actually changed. I think we both just learned it hadn't. But I'd rather you take credit for booking a well-reviewed dessert vendor than for a recipe that belongs to a woman you didn't even keep her rolling pin for. I sat back down. I never raised my voice, not once. And I promise you, if you're ever standing in a room like that yourself, the calm version of the truth lands harder than the loud one, every time. What happened in the minutes after, I mostly reconstructed later, because I left the tent quickly with Priscilla, who materialized at my side with the specific competence of a woman who had, in fact, handled this exact category of event before at other people's weddings. Just never with her own boss standing at the center of it. Carol's face, I'm told, cycled through the same 3 expressions I'd watched on the lawn earlier, except this time with 200 witnesses and no script left to perform for them. She tried for a laugh, something about family stories getting exaggerated over the years. But Denise Calloway, the wedding planner running the event, a woman who had personally booked Larkspur for 11 other weddings that year alone, and therefore knew exactly whose name was on the vendor contract, wasn't in a mood to help her save face. "Carol," Denise reportedly said, loud enough for the head table to hear, "I've worked with this dessert studio 11 times. I know the owner's name. It's Voss. It's been Voss for years." A small, devastating pause. "I really don't think that's your grandmother's recipe." Frank found me in the parking lot 20 minutes later, sitting on the tailgate of a catering van with a coffee I didn't remember pouring. He didn't say much. He never had. He stood near me for a long moment and finally said, "I didn't know. About the trust, about..." I told myself staying quiet was the same as not being part of it. It wasn't. I know that now. I didn't forgive him in that parking lot. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one sometimes rush people toward a tidy ending that real life doesn't actually owe anyone. What I told him was, "I know," which is not the same sentence, and something in his face told me he understood the difference. Carol never approached me that night. She left before the cake was even fully served. Migraine. According to the same second cousin who'd needed my identity explained to him earlier, delivered without any apparent sense of irony. Brooke found me near the edge of the dance floor closer to midnight, still in her dress, mascara smudged in a way that told me the night had cost her something too, whatever else it had cost. "I didn't know about the trust," she said. "Any of it. I was a kid. I had the dance lessons, and I never once asked why you didn't." She paused. "I'm not asking you to fix 14 years tonight. I just wanted you to know I actually saw it. Finally." I don't know yet what Brooke and I will become to each other. We've had exactly 1 coffee since that wedding, careful and a little sad, and also, unexpectedly, the first honest conversation the two of us had had in over a decade. It hasn't resolved into anything clean, and I'm not going to pretend it has. Some doors don't swing all the way open just because someone finally knocked the right way. But they don't have to stay bolted shut either. Sometimes they just crack, and you decide slowly how far you're willing to let them open. As for the wedding itself, it finished the night intact. Brooke and her husband are, as far as I know, doing well. The marriage wasn't the thing that broke that evening. What broke was a story Carol had been quietly telling for years about heritage and sacrifice, and a family legacy that never once had room in it for the niece whose actual mother had built the only real legacy that recipe ever had, 1 lavender honey cake at a time, out of a 12-table storefront on Route 9. I heard secondhand, months later, that Carol stopped hosting her neighborhood's spring fundraiser this year. Nobody pushed her out of it. I think the way it tends to happen in rooms built on borrowed credibility, her currency simply stopped clearing with people who'd been at that wedding. That isn't a punishment I engineered. It's just what happens when the story someone built an entire identity on turns out to have a documented, provable hole in it, in front of the exact audience whose approval she'd spent years managing. I kept one thing from that wedding besides the vendor contract, obviously. Priscilla found it in the dessert tent 3 days later, tucked under a stack of place cards, and brought it to me without asking a single question, because she's good at her job. It was Carol's handwritten toast notes, and at the bottom of the page, in different handwriting entirely, someone had crossed out "our grandmother's recipe" and written above it, small and careful, "Vivian's recipe. Ask Lena." I don't know who wrote it. I like to think it was Priscilla. I've never asked, because some kindnesses are better left as mysteries you get to keep believing in. That page is framed now in the front hallway of Larkspur's main kitchen, next to my mother's wooden rolling pin, VM. Still visible in the burned handle, mounted on a small shelf we built specifically for it. Underneath both, there's a plaque that reads simply, "Vivian, who started this. Lena, who finished it." If your family ever made you feel like your name belonged in a footnote instead of at the table, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need their kitchen to build your own. Sometimes you don't even need their permission to build it out of the exact recipe they once tried to erase. That's my story. A cardboard box, a borrowed name, and a cake recipe that finally found its way home. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments about the table you're building for yourself. I'll see you in the next one.